You've watched it happen in real time. Someone you care about stepping into the same mess again, choosing the same kind of pain with the same familiar excuses. And you feel that quiet panic rise in your chest because the next chapter is obvious to you and somehow invisible to them. So you start doing what you always do. You lean forward emotionally. You offer advice that wasn't requested. You repeat yourself with new wording as if language is the problem. You tighten your patience like a fist and call it love. Because surely if you care enough, if you explain it well enough, if you show them the consequences clearly enough, they'll finally change. And then they don't. And that's when the real struggle begins. Not with them, but inside you. Because now you're not only dealing with who they are, you're also dealing with who you thought they would become. And the gap between those two versions becomes a constant ache that follows every conversation, every silence, every moment where you can feel yourself waiting for them to be different. But what if the waiting is the poison? What if the pressure you're calling support is the very thing that keeps the relationship tense and keeps them resistant and keeps you exhausted? What if learning to meet people as they actually are, without an agenda hidden under your concern, is not giving up on them, but finally stepping into reality? When you want someone to change, you live in a split world, and it's a world that quietly drains you, because there is the person in front of you, their current habits, their present awareness, their limitations, their blind spots, their patterns that repeat no matter how many conversations you have. And then there is the version of them you hold in your mind, the improved version, the one who finally gets it, the one who stops choosing what hurts them, the one who meets you with the maturity you keep hoping will appear. And this is where the friction starts, because every interaction gets filtered through that distance, and you can't simply speak to who they are without also reacting to who they are not. So you listen with impatience. You respond with a correction disguised as care. You offer solutions before they've even finished explaining the problem, and underneath your words there's often a quiet verdict, a subtle disappointment that never fully leaves the room, the sense that they're behind, that they're wasting time, that they're not becoming what they should be. Even when your intentions are clean, the dynamic becomes heavy, because most people can feel when they're being loved with terms attached, and it doesn't matter how gently you phrase it. The nervous system hears the unspoken message, "I'll relax when you improve," and something in them naturally pushes back, not always with anger, sometimes with avoidance, sometimes with defensiveness, sometimes with a numb refusal to engage, because no one likes feeling measured against a standard they never agreed to. If you've ever been on the receiving end of that pressure, you already understand it, even if you don't admit it, because there's a particular kind of fatigue that comes from being treated like a project, being constantly steered, constantly helped, constantly nudged towards someone else's idea of your best self. And even when the feedback is accurate, even when part of you knows they might be right, there's still that inner resistance that rises, the instinct to protect your autonomy, to hold on to the right to move at your own pace, to learn the way you learn, to make mistakes without feeling like each mistake is evidence that you are failing as a person. And this is why the attempt to force growth often backfires, because real transformation rarely happens under emotional pressure. It usually happens when someone feels safe enough to look at themselves without fearing that love will be withdrawn if they don't progress fast enough, and that safety doesn't come from perfect advice. It comes from acceptance, from the experience of being seen as you are, not as someone else's future plan. This doesn't mean you approve of everything, and it doesn't mean you tolerate what harms you, but it does mean you stop confusing control with care. And you start noticing how much of your frustration is built on an assumption that people should be able to see what you see, understand what you understand, act the way you would act. And the truth is, they aren't operating from your mind. They're operating from their history, their fears, their coping strategies, their emotional capacity, and the parts of their past that still shape what feels possible. So the shift begins when you replace judgment with a different kind of question, not "why are they like this?" asked with disgust, but "what are they carrying?" asked with realism, because everyone is carrying something. Sometimes it's obvious, sometimes it's hidden behind competence, charm, humor, or silence. And what looks like stubbornness can be protection. What looks like laziness can be exhaustion. What looks like refusal can be fear, not an excuse for harmful behavior, but a clue that the story is larger than the surface you're reacting to. And when you finally accept that you cannot control another person's readiness, you stop fighting a battle that never ends. Because you can offer support, you can model healthier choices, you can speak honestly when invited, you can hold boundaries that protect you, but you cannot make someone wake up on your schedule. You cannot force insight into a mind that isn't prepared to hold it. And the more you push, the more you risk turning your love into pressure and your presence into a reminder that they're failing to become what you want. There is a quiet illusion sitting underneath most of your frustration with other people, and it's so familiar that you rarely question it. The belief that if you find the right words, the right tone, the right moment, the right example, you can tip someone into change, as if awareness were a switch and love were the hand that flips it, and when it doesn't happen, when they keep choosing the same path. Despite your clarity, you don't just feel disappointed, you feel personally implicated, as though their stagnation is evidence that you've failed at caring correctly. This illusion of control is seductive because it gives you purpose. It turns helplessness into activity. It makes you feel involved rather than powerless, and there's a certain identity that forms around it. The one who sees ahead, the one who understands consequences, the one who carries foresight for those who cannot or will not carry it for themselves. And as long as you believe you can influence the outcome, you don't have to face the harder truth, that most of another person's inner evolution happens beyond your reach, beyond persuasion, beyond love, beyond logic. You can offer perspective, you can share experience, you can open doors, but you cannot make someone walk through them before they're ready to leave the room they're in. And readiness is not a moral achievement. It's not intelligence. It's not even desire. It's often the moment when the cost of staying the same finally outweighs the fear of changing. And that calculation happens deep inside a person, usually in silence, usually after repetition, loss, or exhaustion, not after a well-constructed conversation. This is especially painful when you're watching someone move towards something that will hurt them, because clarity without power is one of the most frustrating positions a human being can occupy. You can see the consequences forming. You can sense the trajectory, and you want to intervene, to pull them back, to spare them the lesson you already know is waiting. But there is a limit to how much wisdom can be transferred secondhand. Some insights only arrive after impact, after disappointment, after the body learns what the mind could not accept. And when you refuse to accept that limit, when you keep trying to manage someone else's development, the relationship itself begins to bend under the strain, because now every interaction carries an undercurrent of monitoring, of evaluation, of are they changing yet? And the other person feels it as a pressure they never agreed to carry. So they begin to protect themselves, sometimes by withdrawing, sometimes by deflecting, sometimes by hardening into the very behaviors you're trying to undo, because resistance becomes the last remaining form of autonomy. Paradoxically, this is where letting go does something unexpected, not always for them, but for you. Because when you stop trying to orchestrate someone else's growth, the emotional tension eases, not because you stop caring, but because you stop pretending you are responsible for outcomes you cannot control. And that shift alone changes the atmosphere of the relationship. The conversations become lighter, less charged, less loaded with expectation, and the other person no longer has to brace themselves against your hope. This doesn't mean they suddenly transform. Sometimes nothing changes at all, but sometimes, without the constant pressure, without the feeling of being managed or fixed, they soften, they become more open, more reflective. Not because you finally found the right approach, but because they no longer need to defend themselves against it. And even then, their growth will still follow their timing, not yours. Because change that comes from safety looks very different from change that comes from force. Letting go also confronts you with a quieter grief. The realization that you might have to accept people as they are, even if that means accepting that certain capacities may never develop, certain conversations may never happen, certain depths may never be reached. And that's not a failure of effort, it's a boundary of reality, one that becomes visible only when you stop pushing against it. And in that space, you begin to see more clearly what is actually being asked of you, not to save, not to accelerate, not to correct, but to choose, to decide what you can live with, what you can accept, what you can engage with honestly, and where you need distance. Because letting go of control does not mean abandoning discernment. It means separating love from responsibility, care from ownership, compassion from self-erasure. When you stop trying to manage another person's path, you reclaim energy that was never meant to be spent there, energy that can finally turn inward toward your own unfinished work, your own patterns, your own avoidance. Because often the urge to fix others is also a way of not having to sit with the parts of yourself that feel unresolved. And when that distraction falls away, you're left face to face with your own growth, unbuffered, unredirected, and very real. And that's when you start to understand that letting go was never about giving up on them. It was about stepping out of an illusion. And what comes next is learning to live with the consequences of that clarity. Once you let go of the illusion that you can steer another person's inner life, something uncomfortable takes its place, a more honest question that you can no longer avoid. And that question is not about them anymore. It's about you, about what you are actually willing to accept, and what you have been quietly hoping would disappear if you waited long enough or loved hard enough. Because when control falls away, expectation is exposed, and expectation is where much of the hidden suffering lives. You begin to notice how often your disappointment is not born from what someone does, but from what you assumed they would eventually stop doing. How many of your private negotiations with reality sound like, I can tolerate this now because it won't always be this way, and how destabilizing it feels to consider the possibility that this might actually be the way they are for a long time or forever. This is where many people get stuck because accepting someone as they are forces a reckoning with loss, the loss of imagined futures, the loss of hoped-for intimacy, the loss of conversations you thought you'd someday have, the loss of a version of the relationship that only existed in your mind. And grief enters quietly here, not the dramatic kind, but the slow, heavy kind that settles into your chest when you realize you can't keep living on eventually. And this grief is often mistaken for bitterness or withdrawal, when in reality it is clarity arriving without anesthetic. You start to see that not every relationship can meet every depth. Not every person can walk with you into the same emotional or psychological terrain, and no amount of patience or explanation will manufacture capacity where it does not yet exist, because depth is not a moral achievement. It's not something you earn by being kind enough or understanding enough. It's a function of awareness, safety, curiosity, and sometimes sheer timing. Some people live comfortably on the surface, and that surface is not fake to them, it is home. They connect through activity, routine, shared history, humor, logistics, and that is sufficient for their nervous system, their sense of belonging, their way of being in the world. And when you try to pull them deeper than they want or know how to go, you're not inviting intimacy, you're creating threat, because depth for one person can feel like exposure or danger to another. And this is where expectations become violent, even when they're silent. Because when you expect depth from someone who cannot offer it, you turn every interaction into a reminder of what's missing. You listen not to connect, but to confirm the absence. You walk away from conversations feeling empty, not because nothing was shared, but because what was shared didn't match what you were hoping to receive. And over time, resentment grows, not toward them, but toward the reality you keep refusing to accept. The shift happens when you begin to distinguish between appreciation and demand. You can appreciate what someone offers without requiring it to become something else. You can enjoy presence without insisting on transformation. You can share space, history, affection, even love, without making it a contract for future growth. This does not mean you abandon your own needs. It means you stop sourcing them from places that cannot supply them. And that distinction changes everything, because now the question is no longer, why aren't they changing? But, why am I staying in a position that requires them to become someone else for me to feel fulfilled? That question is harder because it points inward. It asks you to examine your own patterns of attachment, your tolerance for disappointment, your tendency to confuse hope with avoidance, and your willingness to make choices based on what is rather than what might be. It also forces you to confront the fact that love does not obligate proximity. You can care deeply for someone and still recognize that closeness extracts a cost you cannot keep paying. You can understand someone's wounds without volunteering to be wounded by them. You can acknowledge someone's limitations without organizing your life around compensating for them. This is not coldness, it is discernment, and discernment is what remains when fantasy dissolves. Some relationships will adjust and survive this clarity. They will find a new equilibrium, one built on realistic expectations, cleaner boundaries, lighter emotional weight. Others will quietly drift apart, not because anyone failed, but because the version of the relationship that required constant hope was no longer sustainable. And that loss hurts. There is no spiritual bypass here. There is no empowering reframe that removes the ache. There is only the sober recognition that staying attached to who someone might become can keep you emotionally homeless in the present. So, part 3 ends here, not with resolution but with a threshold. On one side is the familiar exhaustion of waiting. On the other is the unsettling freedom of choosing based on reality. And crossing that threshold changes how you relate to everyone, including yourself. Next, this naturally leads into something even more difficult to hold, the idea that compassion does not require access, and that boundaries are not a failure of love, but one of its most honest expressions. This is where many people misunderstand what acceptance actually asks of them, because they confuse compassion with access, as if understanding someone's pain automatically obligates you to stay close enough to feel the impact of it over and over again, as if empathy were a contract that requires self-erosion and love were proven by endurance rather than honesty. But compassion does not mean exposure. Understanding someone's wounds does not require you to become their containment system. And seeing clearly what shaped a person does not mean you must keep placing yourself in the line of what they cannot yet regulate. This is where boundaries enter, not as punishments, not as ultimatums, not as moral judgments, but as quiet acknowledgements of reality, acknowledgements of capacity, of limits, of what you can and cannot carry without slowly disappearing. Because there is a dangerous narrative that circulates quietly in many relationships. The idea that if you truly understood someone, you would tolerate more, wait longer, forgive endlessly, absorb the fallout of their unresolved pain without flinching, and this narrative sounds noble on the surface, but underneath it often hides fear, fear of abandonment, fear of guilt, fear of being seen as unloving, fear of admitting that someone you care about cannot meet you in the way you hoped. Boundaries force you to face that fear directly. They require you to say, sometimes only to yourself, I can see why you are the way you are, and I can no longer organize my life around it. That sentence carries grief in it. It carries disappointment, and it carries responsibility, because once you stop pretending that understanding automatically equals obligation, you are left with choice, and choice means you can no longer hide behind patience as a substitute for decision. This is especially difficult when someone's behavior is actively destructive, when their struggles spill outward into chaos, volatility, addiction, manipulation, or chronic emotional instability, because part of you wants to believe that if you stay close enough, if you remain available, if you keep loving consistently, it will eventually make the difference that nothing else has. But proximity is not treatment, presence is not rehabilitation, and love is not a substitute for insight. Sometimes staying close does not help someone heal, it simply cushions the consequences of their patterns, making it easier for them to remain where they are and harder for you to remain intact. And when you finally pull back, even gently, even with care, guilt often rushes in to fill the space, telling you that you've abandoned them, that you've failed at unconditional love, that you are selfish for choosing distance. But guilt is not a reliable compass here. Guilt often appears when you stop playing a role that benefited someone else at your expense. This is where acceptance becomes more mature, more grounded, less sentimental. You accept that this is who they are right now. You accept that you cannot change them. You accept that you have limits, and you accept that disappointment is sometimes the price of honesty. Because staying without boundaries can look like devotion, but it often breeds resentment, and resentment poisons whatever love remains. While boundaries, though painful at first, can preserve clarity, dignity, and sometimes even respect, even if closeness is lost. There is also a quieter truth hiding here. Sometimes distance is the only condition under which compassion can survive. When you are no longer in constant contact with someone's unresolved pain, you can see them more clearly, more generously, without the daily erosion of your own nervous system, without the constant internal negotiation of what you're willing to tolerate next. And that distance does not mean you stop caring, it means you stop bleeding. This does not guarantee growth on their part. Nothing does. Sometimes people rise when boundaries are set. Sometimes they simply redirect their patterns elsewhere, and that uncertainty is part of the cost of relinquishing control. You set boundaries not to force awakening, but to align your life with what you can sustain. And when you do that, you begin to notice something subtle shift inside you. Your energy returns. Your thoughts become quieter. Your presence with others becomes less charged. You are no longer watching, waiting, bracing. You are responding rather than enduring. And this is often the moment when you realize that acceptance was never about tolerating everything. It was about telling the truth about what is possible without self-betrayal. Part 4 ends here, at the point where love is no longer confused with endurance, and compassion no longer requires proximity. What follows next is even more unsettling, turning the lens back toward you, toward the ways you may be demanding from others what you struggle to offer yourself. At some point, if you are honest enough, you have to turn the lens around, because the dynamic you're examining does not only live in other people, it lives in you as well. In the moments when you are the one being nudged, corrected, subtly shaped by someone else's expectations. When love starts to feel less like a place to rest and more like a standard you have to keep meeting. Think about how it feels when someone is constantly trying to improve you. Not in loud or cruel ways, but in the quiet accumulation of comments, suggestions, raised eyebrows, carefully framed concerns. The sense that no matter how much you offer, it is never quite enough, never fully aligned with who they think you should be. And even when their feedback makes sense, even when part of you agrees, there is a tightening inside, a fatigue that has nothing to do with effort and everything to do with being observed. Being loved conditionally is exhausting. It keeps you slightly on edge, slightly self-monitoring, slightly disconnected from yourself because you are never fully allowed to arrive as you are. You are always halfway to becoming someone else. And over time, that pressure erodes trust. Not just in the other person, but in your own sense of worth, because you start to associate closeness with correction and affection with evaluation. Most people recognize this pain immediately when it's directed at them. They call it controlling, they call it critical, they call it suffocating. But when they are the ones doing it, when they are the ones pushing, advising, correcting, waiting, it suddenly becomes care, concern, investment, love. This is where self-examination becomes unavoidable. Where are you doing to others what you resent being done to you? Where are you confusing your discomfort with their choices for evidence that they need to change? Where are you projecting your anxieties, your preferences, your timeline, your unresolved fears onto someone else's life and calling it guidance? Because sometimes the impulse to fix others has very little to do with them, and a great deal to do with your own internal unrest. It is easier to manage someone else's growth than to sit with your own uncertainty. It is easier to focus on what they should be doing differently than to confront what you are avoiding in yourself. It is easier to believe that if they would just change, everything would settle, than to admit that even if they did, something inside you would still be restless, still searching, still unresolved. This is not a moral failure, it is a human one, but it becomes harmful when it goes unexamined. Because when you try to shape others to ease your own discomfort, you turn relationships into stabilizers, into emotional supports that were never meant to carry that weight. And the more you rely on them to regulate your inner world, the more pressure you place on them to become someone they may not be able or willing to be. And here is the uncomfortable truth that tends to surface when you slow down enough to see it. Sometimes what you call love is actually a negotiation with your own fear. Fear of being alone, fear of having chosen wrong, fear of wasting time, fear of sitting with the reality that not all connections will grow with you, and that growth often creates distance before it creates clarity. So you hold on, you explain more, you wait longer, you hope harder, not because the relationship is nourishing, but because letting go would force you to confront yourself without the distraction of managing someone else. Part 5 is where this becomes clear. Loving people where they are requires that you stop using them as mirrors for your unmet needs. It asks you to notice when your desire for their growth is really a desire for relief. Relief from your own anxiety, your own doubt, your own unfinished work. And once you see that, you are left with a choice. You can continue pushing outward, trying to arrange the world so that you don't have to face what's unresolved inside you. Or you can pull that energy back, not in isolation or withdrawal, but in honesty, in the recognition that your work is not to perfect others, but to understand why their imperfection unsettles you so deeply. Because until you can sit with yourself without needing someone else to become different, acceptance will always feel like loss, and love will always feel conditional, even when you swear it isn't. This is the point where acceptance is often misunderstood, and where many people quietly resist it because acceptance sounds too much like surrender, and surrender sounds too much like defeat, as if letting go of expectations means giving up on life, on connection, on the possibility that things could be better. And so instead of accepting what is, you linger in a middle space, not fully staying, not fully leaving, suspended between hope and frustration, calling it patience when it is actually avoidance. Acceptance is not resignation. Resignation is numb, passive, collapsed. Acceptance is active, alert, and often painful. It requires you to see clearly without anesthetic, to acknowledge what is available and what is not, to stop negotiating with reality in private while presenting a composed exterior, and that clarity carries grief with it, because every expectation you release is also a future you have to mourn. Most grief is not about what happened, it is about what you thought was going to happen, the conversations you expected to have, the closeness you believed would grow naturally over time, the understanding you assumed would eventually arrive, the version of the relationship you invested in emotionally long before it ever existed in reality. Letting go of those imagined futures hurts precisely because they felt so reasonable. They weren't fantasies in the obvious sense. They were based on potential, on glimpses, on moments when things almost aligned. And almost is a powerful drug. It keeps you tethered to possibility long after evidence has started pointing elsewhere. So when you finally allow yourself to accept that certain expectations may never be met, it can feel like a kind of internal collapse, as if something essential is being taken away, when in truth, what is dissolving is not the relationship itself, but the story you've been telling yourself about where it was supposed to go. This grief does not announce itself loudly. It shows up as fatigue, as disillusionment, as a quiet sadness that surfaces in ordinary moments, as the sense that you've been waiting for something that keeps not arriving. And many people mistake this grief for cynicism or bitterness, when it is actually the psyche adjusting to reality. This is where acceptance becomes honest rather than aspirational. You stop pretending that understanding someone's limitations will magically make them disappear. You stop assuming that enough time will automatically produce depth, accountability, or emotional availability. You stop living in a future that keeps postponing your ability to be fully present now. And this does not mean you stop caring. It means you stop attaching your well-being to an outcome you cannot control. Because resignation says, nothing matters, so why try? Acceptance says, this matters, and I choose to engage with it as it actually is. That distinction changes how grief moves through you. Instead of hardening into resentment, it becomes something you can carry, something you can integrate, something that informs your choices rather than paralyzing them. You begin to recognize that some relationships will never become what you hoped, no matter how much love, patience, or insight you bring to them. And that realization is not a verdict on your worth or theirs. It is simply a recognition of limits, and limits are not failures. They are boundaries of reality. Letting go of imagined futures also frees you from a subtle form of self-betrayal. Because as long as you are invested in who someone might become, you are postponing your own life, your own clarity, your own ability to choose based on what is available now rather than what you hope will eventually show up. You stay longer than you should. You tolerate more than you can sustain. You silence parts of yourself that are already exhausted. And you tell yourself it will all make sense later, once things change. Acceptance interrupts that cycle. It asks you to grieve now rather than later, to feel the disappointment fully rather than diluting it over years of waiting, to release the future you imagined so that you can actually inhabit the present you're living. This is not comforting work. It strips away justifications. It removes the emotional scaffolding you may have been leaning on. But it also returns something essential to you, agency. Because once you stop waiting for someone to become different, you are free to decide what you want to do with what is already here. You can stay with adjusted expectations. You can create distance. You can seek elsewhere what this connection cannot provide. What you can no longer do is pretend that patience will eventually turn into fulfillment. Part 6 ends with this clarity. Acceptance is not the end of caring. It is the end of pretending. And what follows is learning how to be present without an agenda, how to relate without pressure, and how to redefine connection in a way that does not depend on imagined futures. When imagined futures fall away, what remains is presence, not the idealized version people talk about in abstract terms, but a much more grounded, demanding form of presence that asks you to meet what is actually in front of you without trying to edit it, improve it, or steer it towards something more comfortable. Presence without an agenda is difficult because it removes the internal commentary that usually runs alongside every interaction, the quiet evaluation of how things are going, the comparison between what is happening and what you wish were happening, the subtle tracking of progress that keeps you half in the moment and half in expectation. Most of the time, you are not relating to people directly. You are relating to your interpretation of them, to your hopes, your disappointments, your private scorekeeping of what they offer and what they withhold. Presence interrupts that habit. It asks you to listen without planning a response, to be with someone without preparing a correction, to share space without turning it into a referendum on the relationship. And this kind of presence changes the texture of connection, not because it makes everything deeper or easier, but because it makes it more real. You begin to notice that some people meet you at a certain level and no further. They engage comfortably with routine, with logistics, with shared history, with light exchange, and when you stop expecting more, you can actually enjoy what is there instead of resenting it for what it isn't. Other relationships reveal a capacity for depth that feels mutual, reciprocal, alive. And some show you, quietly but consistently, that the distance you've been feeling is not temporary, not circumstantial, but structural. Presence does not blur these distinctions. It clarifies them. Without the distraction of hope, you see more clearly which connections nourish you, which ones drain you, and which ones simply occupy space without offering much in either direction. This clarity is not a call to cut people out indiscriminately. It is an invitation to adjust your investment, to stop pouring your deepest energy into places that cannot hold it, to reserve vulnerability, intimacy, and emotional risk for relationships that demonstrate the capacity to receive them. This is not about hierarchy or superiority. It is about alignment, matching the level of engagement to the level of availability, sharing in proportion to what the relationship can realistically sustain. When you do this, something subtle shifts. You become less reactive, less disappointed, less preoccupied with whether someone is enough, because you are no longer asking them to meet needs they have never shown they can meet, and paradoxically, this often makes you easier to be around. People feel less pressure in your presence. They sense that they are not being measured, corrected, or evaluated. They can relax into who they are, and sometimes that relaxation allows for more openness than pressure ever did. Not always, but sometimes. Presence also reveals something else that is easy to miss. Your own patterns. You begin to notice where you overextend, where you give more than you receive, where you stay engaged out of habit rather than choice, where you confuse familiarity with intimacy. And this awareness gives you the chance to relate more intentionally, to choose connection rather than default to it, to participate rather than endure. Redefining connection in this way does not make life smaller. It makes it cleaner, less cluttered with unspoken expectations, less burdened by relationships that exist primarily in hope rather than reality. You begin to understand that not every connection needs to be deep to be meaningful, and not every meaningful connection needs to be close. Some relationships are steady but limited. Some are brief but impactful. Some change shape over time, and some end. Presence allows you to respond to these shifts without drama, without self-blame, without clinging to forms that no longer fit. It lets relationships become what they are, instead of forcing them to become what you want. And in doing so, it prepares you for the final integration, the quiet understanding that acceptance, when practiced fully, reshapes not just how you love others, but how you live with yourself and with reality itself. That is where this reflection moves next. What settles in after all of this is not a dramatic revelation, not relief, not certainty, but something quieter and more durable. A different way of standing inside your life that no longer depends on other people becoming different for you to feel steady. You stop waiting, not in a bitter way, not as a defense, but because there is nothing left to wait for. You are no longer orienting yourself toward a future version of someone else, no longer suspending your presence in exchange for potential, no longer negotiating with reality in the background of your own mind. And in that stillness, something reorganizes. You begin to relate to people as they actually are, not as problems to be solved or projects to be completed, but as fixed and fluid beings at the same time, shaped by forces you did not choose and changes you cannot schedule. This does not make you passive, it makes you precise. You engage where there is reciprocity. You step back where there is none. You stop over-explaining. You stop chasing clarity from people who do not have it to give. You stop trying to extract depth from places that are built for surface, and none of this requires anger. It only requires honesty. With this honesty comes a strange kind of peace, not the comforting kind people like to promise, but a grounded peace that comes from no longer arguing with what is consistently shown to you. You take people seriously when they show you who they are. You stop translating their behavior into potential. You stop filling in gaps with hope. You stop mistaking effort for progress, and in doing so, disappointment loses its grip. Not because you no longer care, but because you are no longer surprised by reality. Your expectations become simpler, cleaner, closer to what is actually available. And that simplicity creates space to invest in relationships that are mutual, space to enjoy people without needing them to grow on your timeline, space to walk away without turning it into a moral failure, space to stay without pretending things will become something else. Perhaps most importantly, this way of relating changes how you experience yourself. You no longer need to earn rest by fixing others. You no longer define your worth through endurance. You no longer measure love by how much you tolerate. You begin to feel your own limits more clearly, and instead of fighting them, you respect them. You choose what you can sustain. You allow yourself to disappoint others when necessary. You stop performing patience as a substitute for self-trust. And slowly, without ceremony, you come into alignment with your energy, with your values, with the reality of your life. This alignment does not make everything easier, but it makes things clearer.
And clarity reduces suffering in ways motivation never can.
You may still feel sadness for what never became. You may still feel tenderness toward people who could not meet you where you stood. You may still grieve relationships that were built on possibility rather than reality. But that grief is no longer corrosive. It moves, it integrates, it becomes part of your understanding rather than a reason to stay stuck. In the end, loving people where they are is not a technique. It is not a strategy for better relationships. It is a byproduct of maturity. It is what happens when you stop outsourcing your stability to other people's evolution. When you stop needing the world to resolve itself differently in order for you to be present. When you accept that life unfolds unevenly, that people grow at different paces, and that some paths intersect only briefly or partially or not at all. And when you can hold that without hardening, without collapsing, without insisting that things should have been different, something essential becomes possible. You live in your life as it is. You relate without bargaining. You love without agenda. You stay when it's real. You leave when it isn't. And you no longer confuse acceptance with loss, because what you gain is not control. It is freedom, not the loud kind, the quiet kind, the kind that comes from finally standing on solid ground without waiting for anyone else to build it for you.